Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. Now, imagine the situation. A Conservative government fresh from a general election victory the year before, a Labour Party uncertain of its direction and torn between hardline left-wingers and moderates, and a Liberal Party trying to work its way up from a disappointing election result. We could be talking 2020 or 1993 or 1988 or 1980 or 1971 or 1960 or, well, you get the picture, which is why I'm really pleased to welcome on the show this time Duncan Brack, environmental policy expert, former director of policy for the Liberal Democrats, and the closest thing the party has to an official historian with a string of publications he's written and edited with colleagues from the Liberal Democrat History Group. Welcome, Duncan. For all that 2020 feels a very different year in British politics with both Brexit and coronavirus, it also feels, from the point of view of party politics, also in some ways quite a familiar type of year. And therefore, perhaps the party can learn from the past in working out where to go next. So, Duncan, you've particularly written about lessons from the 1990s on what works and doesn't work for the Liberal Democrats. What are the lessons do you think are most relevant to the Lib Dems now?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's good to be on to the only regular podcast I ever actually listen to myself. So it's good to be talking to you. So what I'm
in the post on the way to you for that.
So I'll look forward to it. So what I've been interested in is what became known as the project, the cooperation between Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair in the early to mid 1990s to try and break down the Conservative dominance of British politics, which had lasted since 1979. And this became quite relevant in the wake of the 1992 election, when, in many ways like the 2015 election, it looked like the two main parties, Tories and Labour, were sort of neck and neck during the election. And in fact, it ended up with the pollsters getting it all wrong. And in fact, the Conservatives won with quite a comfortable majority, a bit bigger in 1992 than in 2015. So this led to a period of introspection in the Labour Party about what they should do. And of course, in 2015, it led to Jeremy Corbyn. So it's a bit different there. But from our point of view in the Liberal Democrats, it raised the question of whether, sort of what kind of cooperation there should be between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, because it's worth pointing out that in every single general election since the war, with the single exception of 1955, the combined Liberal or Liberal Democrat and Labour vote has always exceeded Conservative vote. And that's true even in 2015, 17 and 19, though only just on a couple of occasions. So the question always arises, well, in many ways, obviously there are differences, but there are many similarities, many overlaps between Liberal Democrat and Labour positions. What can we do to cooperate to try and stop the Conservatives just winning endless general elections on the minority of the vote?
In that very way that you've framed previous election results, there is a implication that the Liberal Democrats are naturally closer to Labour than the Conservatives. And I think certainly for people who say describe themselves as being centre-left, which I think both of us would be, it's perhaps a matter of basic political spectrum distance measuring, that if you're starting on the centre-left, you may well be closer to a party that's on the left than a party that's on the right. But I think there definitely have been very extended periods of time, and there are still very particular issues on which there are very significant differences between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. I think it's notable how much more relaxed at the moment many in the Labour Party seem to be about the potential threats to our civil liberties from a world in which the government maybe has actually quite a good public health reason to be able to track all of our locations all of the time. Lots of Lib Dems are very nervous about what that might mean for future government power in a way that many in Labour are much more relaxed. So I guess one of the questions is why in the 1990s did it seem that Labour was the natural potential partner in whatever form for the Liberal Democrats to turn to, rather than either the Liberal Democrats sticking on their own or looking towards other parties?
Yeah, that's a completely fair question. Of course, the Liberals and Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party are not the same. And even if you would put us both on the centre-left, which I would, we don't start from the same ideological underpinnings, and we have different views about sort of human nature and the good society. And that certainly became pretty obvious during the Labour governments after 1997, particularly on, as you were talking about, their attitudes to civil liberties and terrorism and the war in Iraq and everything like that. However, you can always point out the differences, but there are stronger, I would argue, similarities, and that's particularly true during periods of Conservative government, because we tend to develop a kind of shared agenda on, for example, in the 90s, the main arguments were around investment in public services, and also a kind of constitutional reform agenda, though perhaps we'll come on to that because the Liberal Democrats had quite an important role to play in the Labour Party's thinking there, but on, devolution to Scotland and Wales, freedom of information legislation, reform the House of Lords, etc., etc. And these are things that the Conservatives would never have contemplated. More recently, I think you can see quite strong overlaps between the two parties' positions on Brexit, for example. Notwithstanding Jeremy Corbyn, most Labour voters, most Labour activists, and most Labour MPs are anti-Brexit. You can see strong overlaps on the environmental agenda, where I think the Labour manifesto last year was pretty good on environmental issues, and the two of ours were much closer to each other than either of us were to the Conservatives. So I think the areas of overlap are stronger than the areas of difference, particularly when, as I said, there's a Conservative government in power. But that does mean you have to be very careful about the kind of cooperation you're going to pursue. And I think that was something that Paddy Ashdown understood during the what became known as the project in the mid to late 1990s.
And just before we delve a little bit into what that actually meant in terms of what sort of cooperation he was interested in and what sort of cooperation he steered clear of, I guess one other thing that's worth reflecting on is that certainly within the Lib Dems, there are many people who are, in fact, maybe even the most vocal opponents of cozying up to Labour in any form, comes actually from people not necessarily who would view themselves as on the right of the party, but people who come from parts of the country where Labour is the local government establishment. So you have a lot of our colleagues, for example, in chunks of urban northern England, would definitely not describe themselves as being right-wingers in any sense, but are very vocal about how much difference there is between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And I guess what, to me, this partly illustrates is how much the electoral context matters, that if you have a party in power, and that may be in the council or in national government, whether that's Westminster, Holyrood or Cardiff, it is very natural for opposition parties to have some common grounds which they can work together on, because you are all opposition parties against it. And in that sense, it strikes me that maybe the Ashdown project would have played out with a Conservative party if Labour had been the party in government at the time that Ashdown was leader of. And so it's easy to read, I think, too much into the ideological question when it's often a matter of practical politics.
Yes, I'd agree with that. And obviously, where Labour in power, the different in local government, the differences between our approaches are much more starkly demonstrated. And I would never close the door to Liberal Democrat Conservative cooperation. I supported the coalition in 2010, and indeed ended up working as a special advisor to Liberal Democrat coalition minister for a couple of years. But I think that in general, and I mean, we saw the kind of, it wasn't exactly a happy episode. I think there are systematically bigger differences between us and the Conservatives and us and Labour. It's not always the case that we only get along when we're in opposition. If you look at 8 years of coalition government between the Liberal Democrats and Labour in Scotland, and the current coalition between us in Wales and previous attempts in Wales, and even going back further into history, the Lib-Lab Pact in the 1970s, I think the scope for cooperation between Liberal Democrats and Labour, depending on all sorts of things, who's the Labour leadership, what the political circumstances, is generally bigger than the scope between Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. And that's particularly true at the moment when you have a particularly unpleasant and incompetent, xenophobic, nationalist Little Englander Conservative Party in power.
That point about Scotland and Wales is an important one, and it's one that, for example, Andrew Adonis quite often forgets when
yes, absolutely.
Somebody who is so smart and so knowledgeable, he makes remarkably error-prone comments about how the Lib Dems only ever go into coalition with the Tories and how evil the Lib Dems are, in part completely overlooking that record of Scottish coalition government between Labour and the Lib Dems, and of course that, as at the very moment that we're speaking and recording this, there is a Liberal Democrat minister in office, in power in Wales, in terms of Kirsty as the Education Secretary there. But coming back to this question about what sort of cooperation may be helpful and what might be not helpful, obviously the backdrop against Paddy becoming party leader was the fallout from the merger between the Liberals and the SDP, and prior to that, the at times nearly amazingly successful, but also at times frustratingly disorganized period of the Alliance Party, where the two parties spent quite a lot of time arguing with each other over things like allocation of seats as to who would stand where in elections and so on. That always struck me quite heavily influenced Paddy's approach, that he looked at the huge amount of time and effort that was taken up in the 1980s between the Liberals and the SDP on seat negotiations, and in part took the view that that's not time and effort well spent, especially if you've got parties that are further apart from each other, and Lib Dems and Labour definitely further apart from each other than Liberals and SDP were. And therefore he seemed to me to particularly look for ways to cooperate that don't involve seat deals.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And I think, Paddy became an MP in 1983, so he was an MP for most of the Alliance period, which was 81 to 88, and saw all the enormous amounts of effort and time that were spent on dividing up seats and then sorting out selection processes, whether they might be joint selection or joint closed selection or joint open selection, all that kind of thing. So when people talk about cooperation between opposition parties, they often automatically think of pacts to stand down to mutually stand down in seats and to divide up seats between them, in the same way that we did with the Greens and Plaid Cymru in last year's election. And actually that was suggested at various times in the 90s, particularly by Tony Blair when he became Labour leader and was starting on that long series of discussions with Paddy. They particularly talked about the idea of a seat pact in southwest England, where in most places the Liberal Democrats looked clearly better placed to beat the Conservatives than Labour did. But Paddy was always very clear that he didn't want to talk about that, partly because of the experience of the alliance. It was just a waste of time and it would just be very bitter. But also because it looked, I think he had a sense, and I think this is supported by opinion polls, that the electorate wouldn't regard that kind of thing very reasonably. They would see it as kind of unfair, parties ganging up on a government. And it was kind of somehow removing the choice from them. So, and there was a opinion poll in the run-up to the 97 election that showed that actually at the time the Conservative government was so unpopular that Liberal Democrat voters weren't particularly opposed to Liberal Democrats cooperating with Labour after the election in government, if that's what happened, but they were dead against any kind of seat deal that looked as though they were trying to gang up on the Conservatives, and that would have scared people who voted Tory in 1992 but thinking of voting Liberal Democrat in 1997 back to the Tories. So Paddy was always very clear we weren't ever going to talk about seat deals.
I guess what may have been different with the Unite to Remain arrangements last year is that arguably Brexit provided a reason that at least we hoped was going to be palatable to the public as to why arrangements between parties would feel like an act of principle rather than an act of organisational chicanery. Very hard to predict British politics at the moment, but I guess it's more likely we'll be in the run up to the next election in a situation where those 1980s type and 1990s type viewpoints prevail rather than the possibility of it being seen as a principled move.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think one thing you learn from political history is that there are almost no permanent truths, and things are highly dependent on circumstances. And 2019 was a bit different, though there I would say, certainly looking at John Curtis's analysis of the election results for the Journal of Liberal History, which we published in our last issue, there was no evidence that the seat deals did us or the Greens or Plaid Cymru any good at all. So, but yeah, it was probably worth trying, I agree. But I think it will be, the atmosphere now is a bit different whenever the next election might be, whether it's 2024 or sooner. I think you're right, I think it'll be more like the mid to late 90s, where there is a chance that the Conservative government will be deeply unpopular by then. And we have in Keir Starmer someone who is far less toxic to the electorate than Jeremy Corbyn, and I would, well, this remains to be seen, I think, but far more open in principle, at least, to the idea of some kind of cooperation with Liberal Democrats. So then it raises a question, which was the question that Blair and Ashdown addressed in the 90s. What form does that cooperation take?
Yeah, and I guess that neatly leads on then to the question of, okay, if seat deals are going to be off the agenda, what is sensible to have on the agenda? So what was it that Paddy Ashdown looked to do with the Labour Party?
Yeah, so there were three main sort of themes, I think, three main approaches. And the first one, which he kicked off quite soon after the 1992 election in a speech that Paddy gave in Charred, it came known as the Charred Speech, and he said later he thought it was the most important speech that he'd ever given in his career. He proposed the idea of cooperation on a policy agenda. So not talking about seat deals or electoral issues at all, but talking about trying to form a kind of coherent view of an alternative to the ways in which the Conservative government's running the economy and running society. So it led to, he tried to focus on a number of issues like Europe. I remember we were going through the Maastricht Treaty at the time and the debates around the single European currency. There was a growing agenda about constitutional reform, which Labour hadn't been particularly active in, but obviously it was one of our core strengths. He wanted to get Labour talking about that as well, again against a background of, I think, increasing frustration with the way in which the British state was governed, particularly in Scotland. You had the Scottish Constitutional Convention, but also to a certain extent in Wales. You had unhappiness with the electoral system and with the House of Lords, etc., etc., etc. And you had a big agenda about investment in public services, which, as I said, the Conservatives were, wasn't quite as brutal as austerity, but they were gradually running down health and education, and that was becoming more and more obvious. So the idea was that the two parties would start saying, not necessarily exactly the same things, because we were different parties, but similar things, and developing a similar critique of the Conservative government. So it helped to create an atmosphere in amongst the electorate that it was the Tories that were wrong, and that everybody else, kind of sensible people like John Smith, Tony Blair, Paddy Ashdown, were actually right, and they could possibly get on with each other. So the second thing was that the two parties stopped, or the aim was that they stopped attacking each other. So they focused their attacks on the government particularly, and that led to some parliamentary cooperation. Occasionally they cooperated over Prime Minister's questions. They tended to avoid criticising each other too much in Parliament, and that's quite different, of course, from recent years when we've seen endless Labour attacks on us because of our participation in the coalition. So, I mean, even if Starmer and colleagues just stopped doing that, that would immediately create a bit of a difference. It led to some practical, that kind of cooperation led to some practical outcomes in that the two chief whips at the time, Archie Kirkwood for us and Donald Dewar for Labour, discovered that the Conservative whips were pairing the same Tory MPs against Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs. The idea is, you know, if you're paired, you can be absent from the House of Commons for constituency reasons or foreign trips or whatever, but the Tories were cheating basically by pairing, you know, one of theirs against two opposition MPs. So they, just by cooperating, they found that out, and that was quite useful. And then the third thing, and this is kind of the most exciting thing, well, I suppose there were four things really, but the third thing that led to an outcome was the idea of covert cooperation in the run-up to and during the election. So obviously we know pretty well, because we're used to targeting our resources during elections now, that there are plenty of seats where we can't possibly win. So we try and focus our resources, financial resources and personnel in the target seats. And the idea was that the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats would cooperate in doing that. They'd kind of share their own their information about what their own target seats were, and that happened. So they would avoid putting lots of effort into each other's target seats, and it helped, of course, in that there were relatively few cases where Labour and Liberal Democrats were fighting each other. I mean, where there certainly was no let-up in the contest, but mostly it was the Tories who were the enemy, and that's just as true now. And they encouraged outside observers to weigh in on this and encouraged tactical voting. So there was a really important stage at which the Daily Mirror, the main Labour-supporting tabloid, just before the 97 election, published a list of 22 seats where if Labour voters backed the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives would be defeated. And in the event, the Liberal Democrats won 20 of them in the 1997 election. And the analysis of the 97 election, which was basically a Labour landslide, again, this is John Curtis, the country's favourite psephologist, concluded that the scale and impact of tactical voting in the 1997 election was unprecedented. And Labour gained between 15 and 21 seats, and the Liberal Democrats between 10 and 14 as a result of tactical switching to defeat Tory MPs. So that's a kind of major outcome where, again, you didn't have an electoral pact, but it affected the electoral outcome.
I guess there's a couple of things that feel quite different about politics now compared to then. One, which maybe also made that sort of cooperation of all the different forms that you've just mentioned, Duncan, easier than it might be now. One is the popularity of Tony Blair, and that he was a phenomenally popular leader of the opposition in a way that clearly Jeremy Corbyn never was. And actually, you know, Blair's heights of popularity were well above, you know, even what Corbyn achieved at Corbyn's peak briefly in the 2017 election. But also that the Liberal Democrats went into the 90s in a stronger position than the Liberal Democrats now. So after the 1987 election felt like a crushing disappointment. The 1992 election was a bit of a disappointment as well. But in both cases, compared to where the Lib Dems are now, the party actually won many more seats and votes. And also the party's local government base was that much bigger. So that sense of, if the Lib Dems say, well, okay, we'll concentrate on those places where we are clearly established as the main rival to the Tories, and there's some places where clearly Labour is the main rival that will maybe soft pedal a little bit, the relative size of those two areas was quite different from the relative size at the moment. And in particular, I think, and we saw a little bit of this with the general election last year, there are quite a few areas where I think the Lib Dems have got a really good, strong and convincing case to make that we are the ones who can best beat the Tories. But unless one is completely myopically tribalist about it, you have to concede that in some of those cases, some of those places, Labour has a little bit of a case to make as well. And one of the reasons the Tories didn't do at least a little bit worse in the election is actually several seats where the Lib Dems did finish a very good, strong second, but with a very large Labour vote. Now, for those seats, next time round, it may be more straightforward, but it strikes me there is another batch of those seats as well, where there's probably going to be a lot more scope for disagreement between the parties than there was in the 1990s as to who was really the challenger. Although there were some places like that. Hastings, I guess, would be a good example where both Labour and Lib Dems claimed we were the real challengers to the Tories. So I do wonder whether part of the success, actually, of what Paddy did in the mid-1990s really was only possible because of his success in the first few years of his leadership, partly in making sure the party didn't disappear, obviously, but also then in beginning to rebuild the breadth of the party's support. And that we perhaps need much more of that breadth of support rebuilding. And that's an important part of the story that we mustn't forget, even though last time that happened to be much more spread out over two parliaments.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I mean, nobody would accuse Paddy of neglecting building up the party and restoring it and building its local government base. And that's completely, in fact, a precondition for everything I've just been talking about. We have to have a strong party that appears to be able to win seats in places where Labour can't, if this is worth talking about at all. But just actually going back to 1992, I mean, none of what we've talking about was obvious then when Paddy started this process. The party had just torn itself apart over merger over the previous 4 years, particularly 1988 and 1990, during the period when Paddy claimed that the Liberal Democrat support in the opinion polls at one point was just an asterisk. There was no detectable support whatsoever. Actually, that was a complete urban myth, and it was never true. But it was made a good story, like a number of things that Paddy said. But I think we did fall as low. We did fall as low as 4%, I think, in some opinion polls during the worst period. So there are some parallels with the last 5 years post-coalition. The local government base had been really badly affected during those 2 years. I'm not sure it went quite as low as it has done recently,
No,
but it didn't start to recover until 1993, 94, 95, I think, when the really big gains were made. And certainly by sort of 95, the Liberal Democrats looked in a much better, much stronger position than they had been in 1992. So it does depend very much what happens over the next few years. And of course, you know, because of coronavirus, it's just impossible to predict how that will happen. Starmer might end up as a really effective, respected leader, not likely to be as popular as Blair, I think, but he might be, you know, he might be quite effective, or he might fail in the same way that perhaps Kinnock did. You know, we don't know. But I think in the current circumstances where we have a Conservative government, that almost everything it's doing is, you know, as anti-Liberal Democrat as you can get. It's worth at least perhaps thinking about whether we want to lay the framework, the foundations for this kind of cooperation, which we can take the opportunity of if politics turns out the way in which we hope it will. So I think kind of trying to stimulate that kind of shared debate around policy priorities that we saw in the mid-90s. And of course, at the moment when British politics and the economy and public services is just completely, everything is being turned on its head. Actually, this is a really good moment to be talking about that. And trying to develop at least informal links between the two parties in the way that Ashdown did over quite a long period from 1992 to 94, just trying to, you know, talk to people behind the scenes, have dinners with them, have discussions with them. John Smith was never particularly open to that, but Tony Blair was, and actually Paddy started talking to him before he became leader, even trying to identify the people you might be able to create a more kind of positive relationship with. I think all those things are worth doing, and you know, otherwise we face the prospect of another Conservative majority in 4 years' time.
And we've talked quite a lot about what Paddy did that worked. I guess one of the risks always with trying to learn from history is that you only look at the things that turned out well and the people who were successful. And Paddy, however, tried an awful lot of different things during his time as leader. So are there any, in amongst the mix of things that he tried that didn't work out, are there any that sort of stand out for you as bringing particularly useful lessons for the present, Duncan?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I realised actually that I didn't mention one thing that I think did work, which was I talked about the shared framework of discussion on constitutional reform. Of course, I should have mentioned the Cook-McLennan process, which was a small group put together led by Bob McLennan for us and Robin Cook for the Labour Party from 1996 to 97, which led to a joint statement published on a list of priorities for constitutional reform, which were pretty much mostly implemented by the Labour Party after they got in 1997. So I mean that's a good example of the kind of thing you can do. Now also that's a kind of nice lead into one of the things that clearly went wrong, because one of the things on the Cook-McLennan reports list was proportional representation for Westminster elections. And of course, this is always the big prize for us, and it always has to be the big prize for us. What Labour committed to was to set up a commission on voting systems, which they did under Roy Jenkins. So, you know, that was a good start. And it reported in 1998 with advocating an additional member system of PR. But then Labour also had the commitment, or at least it was in the Cook-McLennan report, that there would be a referendum on the new system versus the existing system. And Labour completely reneged on that agreement and rubbished the report publicly as soon as it came out, and Blair was entirely neutral. So part of the problem was, of course, that in effect, in many ways, the cooperation of the two parties was too successful, though this was obviously reinforced by the Conservative government's utter incompetence and uselessness in the mid to late 1990s under John Major. So that led to the 1997 election being a complete Labour landslide, as I said. So the case for any kind of coalition between Liberal Democrats and Labour, which had been talked about, and that was the kind of one of the more covert things that had been talked about in the run-up to the election between Ashdown and Blair, even if Labour had a small majority, they thought there might be a case for a kind of progressive coalition government. Clearly, that was completely destroyed when the Labour Party has a majority of, I think, 179 over all other parties. So it was clearly a disappointment. It didn't lead to PR, and the Labour Party's entrenched views on that, they obviously benefited from the first past the post system. You know, they didn't get a majority of the vote in 97, so they wanted to carry on benefiting from it, and that is a problem. And I think that's something that Starmer has to address if we are going to be serious about trying this kind of approach with the Labour Party now. And then it led to, in place of that, there was a joint consultative committee set up between Labour cabinet ministers and Liberal Democrat spokespeople. And it's not really clear that really led to anything. And I think by that stage, we're talking about sort of 98 through to when Paddy resigned as leader in 99. He'd become, I think, fixated on trying to pursue the project to some kind of outcome, even when actually it was becoming increasingly clear that it didn't have anywhere else to go. It had run out of road. The Labour Party was never going to be serious about doing anything about PR or about anything else. So whether the Joint Consultative Committee really led to anything, no one's actually really studied or analysed. I hope, if I ever have some spare time, I'd hope to be able to do that. But it was the sort of consolation prize that Paddy was clinging to, and he became increasingly alienated from his activists, who increasingly didn't understand why we were being so friendly to the Labour Party, which had a massive majority in the House of Commons, didn't need us anyway, and was starting to do lots of things like on civil liberties or public services that we didn't really agree with. So, but I think Paddy was realising that, by that point he was nearing the end of his leadership anyway, and it was probably just as well that he resigned when he did. Otherwise, I think things could have become much less pleasant, more unpleasant between Paddy and the party as a whole.
Yeah, thinking back to my reaction as a party member at the time to the announcement of the Joint Cabinet Consultative Committee, and one of the things that I think underpinned a lot of the anger in the party was a sense of surely the only purpose of this is in some way to cozy up to the Labour Party. Is it going to somehow lead to merger, etc.? Because by that time, the Labour Party was in government and we were in opposition. And I think this reinforces the point we were talking about earlier, that the bigger political context massively matters. Joint parties, both of whom are in opposition, can have a degree of common purpose on some issues that people who even in one party really dislike the other can nonetheless recognise there is a degree of common interest that isn't undermining the fact that you're different parties. Where a party in opposition is cooperating with a party in government in some way, those fears are much greater, and I think justifiably so, because there is less scope in that sense for common ground, because if the party in power has a majority, I should maybe sort of add that caveat, then in a sense they don't need the opposition party, whilst parties that are both in opposition do have a shared objective of something they both want to change. Just though, to go back to the electoral reform point, it was interesting your use of the word referendum there, because I think there are two possible problems if Lib Dems decide to set out our stall for wanting a referendum on electoral reform. One is the whole concept of referendums, which back in the 1980s and into the 90s seemed like quite a progressive, almost daring form of desirable constitutional reform. Referendums have a bit of a different reputation now. The idea has not aged well. The other, though, is that crucially having a referendum takes time, and the moment of maximum negotiating leverage that a smaller opposition party has in a hung parliament, I think almost always is in the first few days of that hung parliament. You've got a leader of another party who really wants to become prime minister. And you can agree things, and if you agree things that will happen fairly quickly, you can have quite a degree of confidence in them. Where things are instead pitched off into the future, there's a much higher risk. And we saw that with the AV referendum and indeed with House of Lords reform in 2010 to 15, where things are pitched further off into the future. There's a much higher risk that they will become undone in some ways. And it strikes me that on that particular point, the sort of the lesson from what didn't happen almost is that if you're going to make electoral reform a top priority, it probably has to be a top priority that is just do it, rather than let's have a referendum and hope that nothing goes wrong and we don't get sunk in the interim.
So I agree with that, and I have to say my position on referendums has been totally consistent. I was policy director for the party, the first policy director actually after the merger from 88 to 94. So I had quite a lot to do with Paddy, who was, of course, chair of the policy committee for the whole of that period. And I remember standing in his office and he was going on about the wonders of referendums, which was sort of part of his general approach that he wanted to look for ways to engage citizens more in politics. And he thought referendums would play a useful role. And I remember saying, I think I'm against referendums in any circumstance. And I remember him saying, that's interesting. But I don't remember what he said after that, which was probably some kind of denunciation of my position.
That may be
so
why you
yeah,
remembered it. Your memory has blanked out the 12-minute rant you then had.
that's entirely possible, though he wasn't always that ranty in
No.
private. So yeah, and my views have been completely reinforced, of course, by the experience of the AV referendum in 2011 and the European referendum in 2016. So I think you're right. I think if it is possible to construct a sort of shared agenda on some issues like constitutional reform with the Labour Party before the next election, I think we have to aim for legislation for PR, not a referendum. You do it straight away. It's in both parties' manifestos. If they manage to get a majority between the two of them or just one of them, then we just do it. We don't worry about a referendum.
And I guess the other element that the lessons, thinking back to the lessons of the 1980s and 1990s sort of highlights for me is this importance of having a political strategy that gives you a sense of achievement, a possible sense of achievement on the staging posts between being a small party and being a one-party majority government. Although, of course, actually a Liberal Democrat one-party majority government would not last for very long because we'd immediately introduce PR and therefore probably lose our majority. But one of the things that Paddy's approach gave was a sense of, okay, although it was a party with a small number of MPs, this is a party that could be part of making things happen and really changing the direction of the country. And that is crucial for recruiting and retaining and invigorating support.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. And I think you could see what he tried to do over a number of different areas. One was targeting of resources much more ruthlessly on winnable constituencies and building up the local party infrastructure there. And it's interesting, I mean, people remember 1997 as a great triumph for us. We went up from 20 seats in 92 to 46 in 97, but our actually vote fell by 1.5 points. So we were targeting. Now, there are problems with targeting, but in terms of delivering MPs, it really worked there. Second thing, obviously building up the local government base, and that was tremendously successful. And the third thing is absolutely contributing, muscling into the debate around policy options, about policy issues, and contributing something that is different from what the other parties are doing. And Paddy, I think, was really good at that. For example, 1989, when he was the only party leader to call for giving Hong Kong citizens, British Hong Kong citizens, the right of abode in the UK after the Tiananmen Square massacre, which received loads of criticism about being flooded with Chinese immigrants, but actually gained him a lot of respect as well. And it was all about fairness, about standing up for our commitments. There was the constitutional reform agenda, and then of course there was the penny on income tax for education, which was just the kind of ideal policy, really, in that it was different from what both other parties were saying, because Labour was being very fiscally responsible at the time and saying we'll stick to Tory spending plans when we get into power, and the Tories were obviously cutting public services. We wanted to put up tax, which nobody else was talking about, to pay for investment in public services, and we identified ourselves with education, which has always been one of the Liberal Democrat core strengths. And I think he had a lot to say on the environmental agenda as well, which was kind of beginning to emerge into more into public debate at the time. So I think what is essential for our new leader, whenever we get them, is that they make sure the party has interesting new things to say on the policy agenda, as well as building up the party infrastructure in terms of parliamentary and local government elections.
And I guess that leads on to one other point about what the pitch is and what works effectively. In that, I think one area that didn't quite work under Paddy Ashdown was communicating to voters the importance of electoral reform, because it does seem to me there is an inherent risk that if we say electoral reform is the absolute red line and that what has to be delivered in a hung parliament for us to in any way cooperate with a party being in power, we also need the public to firstly know that that's going to be our red line. And that's maybe one of the lessons of 2010, to make sure what the public think they're voting for and then what we do afterwards is very closely aligned. So the public has to know that's our red line. But it's potentially quite a tricky red line to have, because although you and I both correctly think electoral reform is massively important, for many members of the public, they require quite a lot of persuasion on that. And the risk is that we have as a red line something that feels irrelevant to them. Now, I guess Paddy sort of didn't, I think, and the party as a whole didn't really get that right in 92. In part, in the run up to 97, the reaction to the lessons from 92 was to talk about more than just electoral reform, but probably in a way that went so far as to really downplay electoral reform as really being any particular red line. I think trying to find some sort of happy medium between those two would very much be a challenge for the party now. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that risk of making something a red line that many members of the public say, at least initially, we're not really that bothered by.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in general, I think I'm against red lines as a whole, or at least being very public about your red lines, because it ends up boxing you into a corner and you end up doing things like signing a pledge on tuition fees and then having to break it. I think you need to have red lines internally, but you can never predict exactly the circumstances they're going to be after the election. And, a coalition or confidence to supply arrangement with one party might be better, even if you don't get all your red lines, than the alternative, which might be, the Tories staying in power on a minority government or something. So I think it's a mistake to emphasize your red lines too much. But having said that, clearly it is really important, as we were talking about before, that if there is going to be any kind of arrangement between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, any kind of cooperation, it does lead to proportional representation, if that's at all possible. So I think the important thing for the next few years is to move Labour in that direction. By any means, informal, formal, public, private, any means we could think of, to try and persuade Labour that that's the right thing they want to do. I think it's always likely to be something that's not worth talking about enormous amount during the election campaign. As you said, we stressed it too much, I think, during the 1992 election, and it scared voters back to the Tories in the last couple of weeks. We didn't really talk about the 97 election at all. It was much more about public services. And I think that's probably right. But I think we need to, if there's any way that we can move the Labour leadership in that direction, and make sure it's an absolutely cast iron commitment in their manifesto and what they'll do afterwards, then I think that's the prize we ought to be aiming at.
Brilliant, thank you, Duncan. I guess it's just worth adding that obviously on quite a lot of these issues that we've talked about, there's quite a range of opinion in the party. And I very much sort of gone for asking you questions, as it were, rather than particularly setting out my own views on them, in part because it's very much for the party members in the end to make the decision. And I think certainly my role as party president, a key element is making sure that members get the chance to make the key decisions on the strategy and direction of the party. And that will partly be through the leadership election when that happens, and making sure that it's a well-run contest that properly involves members, probably in some more innovative ways given coronavirus and the like. But also things like the party strategy process could be a little bit of a dull thing that results in a business motion where almost nobody's in the hall for, or it could be a much more vibrant and effective process. And I think it's really important, given the sorts of issues that we've talked about, that it's the latter rather than the former. But just before we wrap up, obviously lots of listeners are at the moment spending rather more time reading than usual. So I just thought, Duncan, as somebody who has written and edited and read so many books, what would be the best book related to politics or policy making that you've read in the last year that you would maybe recommend to listeners?
So I'm going to cheat here. For two reasons. One, because I want to get in the plug for the Liberal Democrat History Group's publications, which, if you have plenty of time, we publish the Journal of Liberal History, which is a quarterly journal. The next one is due to come out in about 2 weeks' time, and you can subscribe via our website, www.liberalhistory.org.uk. And we cover a whole range of issues from the kind of very early days of liberal thought up to yesterday. For example, our last issue had, as I mentioned before, John Curtis's analysis of the 97 election. And we have a range of books and booklets, longer and shorter kind of summaries of liberal history that I think everybody should be reading, obviously, all the time. On my own reading, now, in fact, I read quite a lot of politics and policy stuff for work reasons, so I tend to relax more by reading about history and fiction. So I can't give you a good politics book in the last year that I've read, but I can go slightly further back and recommend one that I read, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and reviewed for the Journal of Liberal History, which is David Laws's Coalition Diaries. So Laws, of course, was instrumental during the coalition as one of Nick Clegg's lieutenants, and I regularly disagreed with him on policy issues. But I have to say he's written the most interesting analysis of the coalition, and I think he was a really effective fighter for many Liberal Democrat views during the coalition. The first book he came out, just called Coalition, is a kind of worthy and not terribly exciting analysis of how it all worked and what happened. I think, yeah, it's definitely worth reading. But Coalition Diaries, which is, as I said, just extracts from the diaries he kept during the whole period, is much more exciting read. It's quite long, but you do get a real feeling for just the pressures and stresses that Liberal Democrat ministers operated under, and also it's really entertaining because he dealt with Michael Gove. He was a junior minister in the Department of Education when he came back, when Gove was Secretary of State and Dominic Cummings was his special advisor, and some of the sheer bonkers nature of Gove and Cumming is really well picked out in the diaries. And I particularly like the episode when Michael Gove fled into his own toilet and hid there until David Laws left the room, when he was trying to avoid talking to Laws about some outrageous things that Gove and Cummings had done. So I recommend it. It's a good fun read, and you can dip in and out of it.
And actually another good fun read from David Laws that's rather shorter is his book about the death of Lord Kitchener in the First World War, which I read last year, and is a really, really interesting, really enjoyable read, even if it's a topic that you know quite a lot about, and it is a really interesting book. But for those who maybe only know of Lord Kitchener as maybe that person whose recruitment poster is so regularly pastiched now, there's an awful lot of fun and enlightenment to be had from that. I'll include links to all of those in the show notes, as well as links to a couple of previous episodes of this podcast, including the one in which was recorded shortly after Paddy's untimely death a few months back, which sort of pays tribute, and where we Stephen and I have a look at his record as party leader, coming, I think, to fairly similar conclusions as we've come to in this podcast, but listeners can compare and contrast takes on Paddy's time as leader. And finally, therefore, just to say, you can find Duncan on Twitter at Duncan Brack, myself at Mark Pack, or this podcast on at Bar Chart Podcast. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and review or rate it in your favourite podcast app. Thank you very much.